has really been such an honor for us at Downstate to have worked alongside the mayor and his wonderful team over the past several years on efforts surrounding lifestyle medicine and plant-based nutrition. Thank you so much for that wonderful message, Mr. Mayor. And now I have the distinct privilege of telling you a little bit about our keynote speaker today, Dr. Columbus Batiste. Dr. Batiste is a board-certified interventional cardiologist and assistant clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine. From 2008 until 2020, he served as the chief of cardiology there, and he currently serves as regional medical director of home-based cardiac rehab and chair of the Regional Cardiac Quality Committee for Southern California Permanente Medical Group. A bit more than a decade ago, Dr. Batiste began to shift his clinical focus, moving away from prescriptions and procedures as the only way to manage chronic disease. He expanded his clinical care to promote nutrition, stress reduction, and exercise. He went on to establish the Integrative Cardiovascular Disease Program at Kaiser Permanente, a program that worked with heart disease patients to prevent future cardiac events using lifestyle modification. He's since gone on to treat thousands of patients. Dr. Batiste's passion for sharing information about the benefits of plant-based nutrition, daily exercise, and stress reduction is rooted in his desire to help people take control of their own health and then go on and spread the word, what he calls each one can teach one. He understands that the health of an individual has its roots in their community, and to that end, he focuses on what we in public health call the social determinants of health. Factors that can lead to disparities in education, business, justice, and health. And he's going to tell us more about all of that now. I am so thrilled, so excited that we have Dr. Batiste joining us today. Welcome.
Well, good morning. Bring you greetings from Southern California. I do have to say I was a little bit taken aback by one of your fearless leaders, Dr. Rosenfeld, who decided to go ahead and show me his pictures of himself without a shirt on, his six-pack, his biceps, just to go ahead somehow and intimidate me. And I felt this is a little bit of pressure on me as I'm traveling, no time to exercise, my hydration is off, all those things. But I will tell you, it is a pleasure to be here. And I want to begin the process of discussing with you a different aspect as it relates to plant-based eating, to wholeness, to wellness. And so I'm appreciative of Dr. Helsner for the invitation, for the kind words. I think my mother would be proud, and my wife would be proud too as well. We can go ahead and start the slideshow. That would be great here. So I am learning in this new era. I think one of the things that ages me is the fact of trying to navigate this space called social media and making sure that we go ahead and we advertise for ourselves. So you can follow me at Healthy Heart Doc on Instagram. My wife would be mad if I didn't say that. But I do have to say this as I get started, and I will get into this, is that I've had the great privilege and honor of partnering with a woman for the past 24 years this past May 3rd. And so, yes, she actually continually sacrifices to allow me to do what is my passion, and that's evolved. And so a bit about me is I didn't stumble on this. This is something I felt forced into. It wasn't something I set out to do when I started out as a cardiologist. My goal was to perform procedures, period. Put stents in, develop procedures and structures for structural heart disease, not to speak about plants at all. But I felt impassioned that I had to after watching my dad pass away in front of my eyes. I was planning a trip to my brother-in-law's wedding and went by my dad's house, who was suffering from the very thing that Eric Adams mentioned, diabetes. And I watched him pass away in front of my eyes as a board-certified internal medicine physician, as a board-certified cardiologist, interventional cardiologist. And all those words of people saying, "You saved my life," felt like daggers in my heart. And I knew I had to do something. And so I arose out that situation. We all have stories. And I knew I had to do something to unravel this thing of this paradox that seems to be attacking many communities, all communities. But as a cardiologist, I take care of patients with stable disease. We call that stable angina. but I also take care of patients who have critically unstable disease in the throes of a massive heart attack. Those are the ones where my focus of attention is drawn towards, because those individuals are at the greatest risk of peril in that moment. And so what I realized in this journey towards lifestyle is that there are certain segments of our population that are under risk, a heightened level of risk, over and beyond those who are there. Now, we can't start any talk without talking about COVID, right? Look at what COVID has done. We're wearing masks. We're socially distanced. We've had many of the things. I just saw a report saying we've just surpassed 1 million deaths that's here. We know that COVID has revealed so many things about us. The most important is that we know that Americans as a whole are living sicker and dying sooner. Yes, COVID showed us this. It exposed the fact that we are dying of diseases, of chronic disease, where, 60% have at least one chronic disease, 40% have one or more. That we know 70% are taking prescriptions on a regular basis compared to other industrialized countries. We're living sicker and dying sooner than other places. And so the question is why? Why is it that we're living sicker and dying sooner? Why is this that Americans live sicker and die sooner? I'd say that this three-letter word called stress. How many of you all have experienced stress? How many of you all have experienced stress? Come on now. Come on now. I know I experienced stress. All right? And so stress, this word, I'll tell you, it's so powerful that even now my 17-year-old and 15-year-old, they also experience stress. I say, what do you have to be stressed about? But my daughter just explained to me as she's taking these AP exams that someone from her school was taken out by an ambulance just this past week, stressing over making grades. Why? Because something I had never heard of when I was applying for med school. GPA is a 5.0, 4.7. AP exams and the pressure that's there, this stress is now emanating to our kids, to our children. This idea of stress equals demands minus resources. When we feel as if the stresses of life, it outweighs our resources, our capacity, when we have to pick the kids up at 3 p.m., but we don't get off work until 5, when the likes of Rachel wants to come and support me, but she needs to be here and there and the other, and so stressed and trying to figure out, can I be in 2 places at once? Stress demands minus resources, and what studies have shown, what we've seen distinctly is the fact that low perceived control is a determinant of heightened stress response and poor adaptation. Now, there's a famous Whitehall study. Now, you public health students, I know, are very much so aware of this. Well, what they looked at is the individuals who are most under stress are those, you would think it's your president of the United States, you would think it's others who age, but it's those who have no control or at heightened stress. Those are the ones who have heart attacks. It's what the study has shown in general, so I may need a little help with advancement here, folks, if this doesn't go through. So as they grab that, because what ends up happening is this could evoke stress right here, right? As I'm presenting and I lose control of technology, which is so important, that suddenly, the hormone cascade starts to kick in. The pupils start to dilate. The vessels begin to crimp down. As the stress hormone cascade perils through, as I see individuals looking at me through the audience and wondering, what's next? What is he going to say? Right? As they're there and we're waiting. And so this stress is so powerful as we look at the impact that it has on us. Once again, this low perceived control. When you feel as if you don't have control, to advance your slides, right? And it generates this response inside of you on occasion. And so one of the things that we'll do, let's pull this up, and I'm going to go old school here in just a moment. Where there's a will, there is a way. So let's do this. Oh, we're up. All right. See that? Perceived stress. Perceived stress. I perceived stress, but stress wasn't really there because there wasn't an issue. So when we say this chronic exposure, this poor social support, this is a study from 2001, but read this. Chronic stress, poor social supports, limited social networks. What does that sound like? The past 3 years. Right? It increases your disease risk is what that showed. And so we know over and beyond that when we look at the correlation between stress, it impacts cancer outcomes, that we're more inclined to develop cancer. That when we look at stress, you're more inclined when you normalize for other risk factors to develop diabetes.
that when you perceive stress, you're more inclined to have heart disease. Now, some of you have heard, how many of you guys have heard of the broken heart syndrome? How many of you have heard of Takotsubo, broken heart? I see the hands go up. That's a scenario that happens when all of a sudden you succumb to massive amounts of stress. That this stress is something I never heard of inside med school. But now seemingly it seems as if I see it on a regular basis, about once every other month in the cath lab. And where an individual will have their heart suspended, it's frozen, it's paralyzed. They mimic as if they're having a heart attack, but the heart ceases to squeeze in that instance from an overwhelming stress that transpires. Stress in strokes, stress in heart disease. COVID has revealed so much to us. It's really uncovered many things that have been there. It's told us that all roads lead to the heart. Or some might say, our interventional radiologist right there may say, they just lead all throughout the entire body. The cardiovascular system is so important. One of the things we started learning about, we heard new words like endothelium. That somehow this COVID, the SARS-CoV virus, it impacted things through this lining. Well, how so? Well, your lining of your vessels, how many of you guys have seen this thing here called a Teflon pan? You can fry anything. I know you all aren't frying. You're not putting eggs on there, right? You're not putting cheese on those eggs there, are you? All right? But if you were, you know that nothing would stick to it. It's impermeable, right? Nothing sticks to it. But over time, as you continue to use it, things change. We can actually assess the function of your endothelium inside the cath lab, but also inside of clinic. Now, we don't do it often in clinic, but we can check and see how responsive your vessels are. So the more your vessels, like a water hose at home, that rebounds back, that means the healthier your arteries are. The healthier your arteries are is very predictive of disease, as we'll see shortly. But when that vessel starts to look like that old frying pan that's been sitting inside your cupboard for a while, I see some heads in acknowledgement. They've seen this pan before, right? Now, all of a sudden, everything sticks to it. All of a sudden, things begin to shift. They begin to change. And what we see is we see a cascade that all of a sudden, this lining that's so powerful. It's like a superhero. It allows the vessel to dilate. It inhibits growth. It prevents clot from forming. It prevents inflammation. But when it becomes disease, the tides change, and all of a sudden it constricts. We see that it has excessive growth. Inflammation occurs, and clotting occurs too as well. That promotes, but we know that chronic stress is directly related to it. So if I have this issue where I couldn't advance my slides repeatedly day in and day out, this acute stressor becomes a chronic stressor. This acute stressor, all of a sudden, it triggers a cascade to my medical students that are there, my nursing individuals that are here, that you all will remember from all of these cycles, right? That is going to ultimately lead to constricting the vessels. It's going to lead to all of this atherosclerosis and the inability for the artery to say no to disease. We call it nitric oxide. It's no longer able to excrete that at all. How does that play out? Well, when we measure the functionality of the arteries, called flow-mediated dilatation, how well does the vessel dilate? I showed you that description. We know that mental stress drives down the artery's ability to dilate. I'm going to refer to this all the time. Sorry, guys, back there, my tech team, right? So when I am stressed, speaking in front of an esteemed audience, they call me the keynote speaker when you have the likes of Dr. McMacken back there, who's done wonderful work throughout the entire nation, published and built an entire program. You know, the stress builds. I have to perform in front of the likes of individuals like that. And so this stress leads to your arteries declining. The ability, that functionality that's there. Studies have shown now the MESA trial, looking at the youth, that increased tiers of stress. When your stress is at the highest, your arterial response is at the poorest. It's reflective. Stress plays a role in stress throughout all of the body. Isn't that right, sir? Stress throughout all the body, the vasculature. We know good and well there. It leads to everything from diabetic foot all the way up to sleep apnea. That we know that there is a relationship that occurs between this thing called endothelial dysfunction, that this lining becomes damaged, and there's issues that happen. But I will tell you that COVID also revealed another hidden secret. It revealed a hidden secret that is not so very secret, that black people in America live sicker and die sooner than other people. It's what it showed, and it seems as if this is something new, but as a matter of fact, it's nothing new.
In 1899, W.E.B. Du Bois, he mentioned, what did he say? He said that one thing we must, of course, expect to find, and that is a much higher death rate at present among Negroes than among whites. They have in the past lived under vastly different conditions, and they still live under different conditions.
That sounds very apropos to 2022, doesn't it? It still sounds very similar. We know that studies have revealed that black and brown individuals are more likely to have chronic disease. We know that studies have revealed, too, as well, that at all ages, individuals of African descent live sicker, higher rates of high blood pressure, what my wife's dad passed away of, the same year my dad passed away of. Higher rates of diabetes, what my father passed away of, what Eric Adams mentioned he suffered with. Higher rates of stroke, not just those things, but of ill effects. We see that at similar ages, we see that African Americans they die sooner, too, as well, at higher rates in the burden of disease. So why is this? If we're all under stress, why is it that African Americans live sicker and die sooner? I'd say it's because of a unique stressor. How many of you guys know what that unique stressor is? Yeah, I see a few hands go up. All right, it's racism. It's hard to escape your skin. It's hard to escape your skin. You say, well, Doc, how is that? Well, the work of the likes of David Williams out of Harvard, it's done tremendous work. And he characterized something, think of it like microaggressions. There's something called everyday discrimination scale. How many of you have ever been treated with less frequency, less courtesy, less respect, poor service, that somehow you're seen not as smart, that somehow people act as if they're afraid of you, that you're dishonest, that they're better than you? You say, well, Doc, that's all of us. That shouldn't really matter. Well, how many of you guys have read this book by Isabel Wilkerson? Put it on your to-do list. Put it on your Audible. My wife says when I say I read a book and I listened to it on Audible, she says, you didn't, you listened to it. So listen to the book, right? And so she makes a powerful statement as she analogizes the race situation in America to the caste system. And she says, caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in hierarchy. You say, well, does that really happen? I'll tell you. So I'm an interventional cardiologist, which my job is to stop a heart attack in its throes, put stents in, balloon open vessels. I work with the surgeons, trying to determine when a patient needs surgery or when I can safely give them plant-based nutrition and lifestyle. I'll never forget, my attention was drawn one day. I was called to the cath lab. We have individuals who don't do the procedures I do, but they just take the pictures. And so this person was, we'll use the terminology of a different caste than I was. And so he called me in and said, hey, Columbus, what do you think? I said, it looks like surgery. I said, here's disease, here. I said, you know, this is a disproportionate amount. I think we have to consider and have a consultation. So the surgeon came in, who also was of a similar caste to the individual I was speaking with. And he turned from looking at me and turned to the other individual, the different caste, who's not as trained as I was. What do you think? Do you think that this should be done? Do you agree with him? In that instance, microaggression, micro. And we say, well, it's not just me. Tarmac experience for Barack Obama. Finger wagging. We look, you're a liar, inside of Congress, by the senator, the representative, rather, from South Carolina. That happens. We look at our judicial system. That all of a sudden come into question an individual highly trained, highly ranked, that in a moment called into question in that moment. We see these things happen. And so the likes of Toni Morrison, she characterized things well, and she said, there is no such thing as race, none. There is just human race, which we all agree, scientifically, anthropologically. Racism is a construct, a social construct. It has a social function, which is racism. And that's what we're here to combat. And so we know that there is a social construct of racism, is what we see. That's distinct. And we know this. We know that there is something, you'd say, call it de facto, right? Is it by fact that people choose the conditions where they are born, they grow, they live, they age, where they work and they pray? These are by de facto. People just choose to congregate over where they're at. It's not by law, is it? Or you look at political determinants of health, a new terminology, like the Daniel Dawes out of the School of Morehouse, where he mentioned that these are broader, these are more important, that these are bigger from a systemic standpoint, where we look at state laws, federal laws, judicial laws, executive orders that play a role in the outcomes. Is it by de jure? Is it by law that many of these things begin to happen? So let's take a few moments back through history. If I could be anything else, I would have been a history teacher. I love, love, love history. I love history. As a physician, it's one of the first things I do. After I find out the current state, the next thing I go to, am I right, physicians? Past medical history. I go to past surgical history. I want to know your social history. History is extremely important. And so as we begin this process, we know the GI Bill, it's important for empowering. And so there was recent legislation that looked at the inequities of the GI Bill and how individuals actually were not granted the educational benefits when they came out of the war after fighting for the country. Things that the education has been shown to be a benefit. We know that there was distinct evidence and studies to show that there was a disparity in terms of being able to access the educational components of the GI Bill. And so when you know this, we know that studies have subsequently shown that the less education you have, the higher your disease burden. There's a direct relationship that's there in this area there. What about where we live? Our ability to buy homes. Well, look, even here in the great state of New York, and I do love New York, it's my first visit here. I'm planning to do some sightseeing, I'm looking forward to it, and going around even in the midst of rain. I couldn't bring in sunshine from California, I tried, right? But we know that when we look at the disparities as it relates to granting of mortgages from individuals of color compared to those who were Caucasian, it was stark, markedly different. That the wonderful book written by Richard Rothstein now at Brown University spoke about redlining. I had a colleague who said, he started giggling to me and said, Columbus, I had never heard of this thing called redlining. I just learned about it. I said, Eric, it doesn't really matter. One of my other interventionists, I said, I probably learned about it about 10 years ago, unfortunately, as sad to say, in great detail. And this restriction of areas in which an individual can live, that the territories were earmarked out and not allowing individuals to buy homes in particular areas. And so we'd say, well, that's a long time ago. But we're still seeing evidence of it, that individuals are still reporting bouts of racism, inability to refinance their home, areas of equity that is there that are limited and impacted. We see these in the areas in which the federal government has gone and they have acquired land in order to build transportation systems that are there, highways and railways and things of that nature, which has destroyed communities. And we create smog and various aspects, and we see the distinct relationship between health and outcomes is what we see. We see this on a regular basis. And these studies, like the ones done at Robert Wood Johnson, they show the correlation between our wealth and our health outcomes. We see this. So this idea of perceived stress. Are you guys getting this idea of perceived stress? As I advance the slides, do you get this idea that somewhat of what can transpire here? You know, so when we see this idea of wealth, and we start to begin to put into perspective, was this just by chance or was it by construct? What really transpired that has built a scenario, and we see that individuals, not surprisingly, who are under increased levels of stress, financial stress, have increased burden of heart disease. And study revealing African Americans and the burden of disease that begins to happen. What do you do when you get stressed? What do you turn to? What do you turn to? What do you do when you get stressed? That's the thing. As we said, stress equals demands minus resources. How do you recoup your resources? What do you turn to? Well, you turn to your environment many times. And many people are motivated. The likes of psychologist Doug Lyles had called it the motivational triad, right? That what's my tendency? Avoid pain. That may mean I don't want to engage with people because you may hurt my feelings socially. I may choose not to have to get up and go shopping and go to new areas. I'm avoiding pain. I want to seek pleasure. I want something that's going to give me immediate pleasure. I want the mad rush of Oreo, oh, I shouldn't say Oreo cookies. I want the mad rush of the cookies that, like the gentleman spoke about earlier, right? That gives me that immediate click that's there. I want to exert the least amount of effort These are the things that lead to bad habits, and these are the things that we begin the process of seeing and understanding what truly transpires inside of here. Many of us end up going on, I told you last night to some of the crew there that I am a recovering sugarholic. My name is Columbus, and I love sweets. And many people I know go on dates with Ben and Jerry when they're stressed out. They go on dates with Ben and Jerry because they love it, because stress is simply dessert spelled backwards, right? And what they do is they live in these communities, right, that have been bisected, and where fast food companies have been very intentional in placing their establishments along the highways and in these communities. That we see that during the civil rights era, what transpired in that moment was you had the mass destruction in many major cities. And so as the likes of, during the time of, from a historical standpoint, Richard Nixon said we need to revitalize the communities. And so in that moment, what he did was he said, let's build up small business association loans. And who would the loans go to? Those who have the highest profit margins, fast food companies, liquor stores, that began to go ahead and be vestiges inside of these communities. Is what we saw out of the ashes was built this supersized urban America. This supersizing of urban America, a wonderful book written by Chen Zhou, right? And so we know it's filled with weapons of mass destruction is what we see on a regular basis here. Some would call it food deserts, where you have an overabundance of these fast food companies. Or some would call it food swamps, the absence of health-promoting foods. Others would characterize it as food apartheid, that these are actually not areas that are natural occurrences, that these are, as a matter of fact, are not de facto, but they are de jure. They are created areas that are there because the business of business is business, not of health. The business of business is business. And so these areas have led to higher stress, right? The higher our stress, the poorer our health is what we see distinctly. And so let's kind of take a little bit here, because we've learned this idea that zip codes matter. Zip codes do matter. I grew up inside of Compton, California. You plug that zip code in, and it'll tell you a lot about the demographics inside that community. And so we know that this is an issue. And so what are the biological effects of racism? Very similar as a stressor. What happens here? We begin to see this start to unfold, and it starts to make sense that discrimination is independently associated with elevations in intrinsic amygdala activity. So basically, I'm gonna tell you this. The amygdala is going to retain everything you're scared of. And it begins that process of storing it and connecting it with your frontal cortex. The amygdala is going to trigger that stress and have the body respond to it. So when you begin to perceive this on a repeated basis, that all of a sudden you begin this whole chronic stress cascade, this a reminder of what's transpired in the past. It's important. We're going to build a story that's here. And so as we look here, we know that as well, we look at when the amygdala begins to kick in discrimination, we see too as well that there is this level of inflammation that builds inside the body, this low-grade inflammation. Now, we heard about this with COVID, didn't we? We heard that obesity and low-grade inflammation does what? They increase the burden and the risk of poor outcomes during COVID, that you tend to see it inside increased obese individuals. These studies have pointed to that individuals under repeated discrimination have low grades of inflammation in their body. Why is it that black people live sicker and die sooner? We're starting to see things kind of take place here and increase our risk. We see too as well that as we begin to look through, we see that it increases C-reactive protein, very predictive that you're going to have to come and see me at one point in the future. Predictive of cardiovascular events is what this is, and is a response in relationship to systemic inflammation. Many studies kind of point to the same thing. Wonderful work done now, Journal of American College of Cardiology, and basically showed that, once again, we look at poor or low socioeconomic status mixed in with discrimination, that we're seeing that, once again, this whole trigger of cascade through the amygdala that leads to inflammation, they begin to elucidate exactly how that transpires. Looking at the bone marrow, the interaction that's there, leading to the cells, leading to events that occurs, that makes you once again end up coming to see me. Why is it that we live sicker and die sooner? We see that, once again, the endothelial function, all roads lead back to the heart. That when we look at the endothelial function, that we see, once again, that there is a burden and a risk to socioeconomic status, that we see that there is a relationship to impaired vasodilatation or the vessel health. in general. We see your platelets are more reactive. We're seeing all these things transpire. We see too as well on top of the platelets reacting, we see that there is an increased risk that there is disruption of the small layers. I'm gonna pause for a moment. I wanna tell you one thing real quick. How many of you think that most heart attacks happen from areas of blockage, 70, 80, 90%? Raise your hands. Make sense? No? I mean, sometimes I ask obvious questions, guys. Hands up. How many of you think that they happen from areas that are 10, 20, 30, 40%? A few hands up. The few hands are actually right. That means it would never show up on the EKG. It would never show up on the treadmill test. That means in the cath lab, I would never even think to do anything about it. But these areas are like kids who have little small bumps that are there that get inflamed and erupt. And we've seen this during the teenage years, right? Those pimples that explode, that's like the lining of your vessels. These are the areas that become disruptive, and so when they're unstable, they can explode and lead to a cascade that shuts down the vessels inside the delivering blood flow to the heart muscles. So there is a relationship is what we see. When we look at communities at high risk, this is something else COVID really showed. And I want to take a few moments. This is important. This is important. In communities with a high level of frisking, right? So we're talking about police stopping and so forth. We found increased levels of PTSD, nervousness, and mental stress, not only by those touched directly by the law system, but also others within the community. I want to pause. I have a son who's 15 years old. He is 6 feet 2 inches. Yes, he is my son. Don't look at me that way. All right? He is my son, 6 feet 2 inches tall at age 15, size 15 something shoes that he wears, grown man shoes. When everything unfolded during 2020, my son showed fear. If I exceeded the speed limit of over 70 miles an hour, I said, Dad, what are you doing? Do you want to get stopped? Do you want something bad to happen? He began to look at a level of fear inside this child, inside of a grown man's body. And so I want you to understand that there's a domino effect, and you see this chronic layered stress that begins at a young age and builds throughout a lifetime of experiences. And we wonder, and we ask the question once again, why is it that certain segments of the population live sicker and die sooner than others? We see that this is manifest in terms of nutrition. And I want to tell you, I applaud those. I applaud the work of Mayor Adams. I applaud the work of those who are bringing attention to the role of nutrition in disparities, nutrition in disease, and how we need to address this issue, because we know that nutritional stress, pause for a moment, nutritional stress is not just eating bad food. Nutritional stress is the absence of health-promoting foods. Get that now for a moment. Nutritional stress is obviously eating disease-forming foods, but nutritional stress is also not having access to health-promoting foods, not eating health-promoting foods. It's a combined approach. We live so much inside of factions. We talk about, oh, I'm whole food plant-based. Oh, I'm plant-based. Oh, I'm vegan. I'm vegetarian. I'm gluten-free. I'm pescatarian. I'm this. I'm that. I'll tell you what it boils down to many times. Everyone is living off the standard American diet, calling it whatever they want. That's filled with salt, sugar, and fat. And I want to let you know today is that all these things create stressors in our body. Foods that are filled with salt, sugar, and fat, these things we unfortunately have to call the standard American diet, it triggers a process of inflammation in our bodies. It triggers a process of stress in our bodies that ends up leading to inflammation and increased cardiovascular events. I want to let you know here today that when we begin the process of looking at this thing of nutritional stress, that this nutritional stress, it does indeed damage the vessels, the lining of our vessels, the endothelium, and that the absence of things like antioxidants. Say here, looking at individuals, they were going to surrogate fruits and vegetables. I love the water, so sweet from just natural things. The blueberries and raspberries and strawberries, just powerful. Thank you for that, right? That when you supplement that, all of a sudden, guess what ends up happening? That the dilatation of the vessels improve astronomically in those individuals who are devoid of it. There's power when you begin the process of changing your diet, that we see that there. We see that when we love our grilled whatever it is, I want to tell you that the barbecue, it sounds good, but it's not so good for you. When we begin to add these things, it begins to age you. Ages you on the inside and the outside, right? And so this whole process leads, once again, to endothelial dysfunction, and we see this manifest. That when we have foods with increased advanced glycation end products, which is the combination of sugars and proteins, and the high heats that marry them, our endothelial function declines. That when we begin the process, so what we eat matters and how we prepare it matters. That it's salt, which is a major issue for cardiologists, right? For blood pressure, for heart failure, and so forth. But salt isn't just retained in the fluid as we go forward. Salt also independently has been shown to damage the lining of the vessels, and it impairs the endothelial function, is what we see inside of studies. And these will be available for you to look at the references later as I kind of go through these at high volume speed. We also know sugar. I told you I'm a sugarholic. I'm a sweetaholic. I would tell you my beverage of choice as a teenager, but you would be appalled at what I drank on a regular basis. Almost zero water and always a brown colored soda on a regular basis. That will wash down. I drank that inside of med school, residency, before I finally had a transformation. My wife said that I ascended to a higher level, is what she told me. She said, I'm almost at the point of only eating air, right? And so, but when we look at these things here, that's what we see. It's the same sort of thing. We look at our fats, the same sort of scenario. As we move down the road and we look at these saturated fats, which are contained in animal products, they are the most likely to impair your endothelium. Saturated fat meaning animal products. Well, it's not just about the fat. We also see it in something you all have heard of called trimethylamine oxide. That in these areas here, we see that when you have the low levels higher levels of trimethylamine oxide, that what ends up happening is when you give them the ascorbic acid, it can improve. So this is showing the power of nutrition even in a setting. We love to live in a state of all or none. I like to say, what are you adding to your diet? That becomes important. And this is demonstrating that when you begin to add in some of those salient components, even from those individuals who are eating foods that are less than ideal, it can help them. There's power in small movements. And so what are the results of all these things? Once again, we talked about zip codes matter. We talked about the issue that that our health is tied to our resiliency divided by our stress. As a result, we see individuals who suffer with these experiences of racism increased risk of developing breast cancer. The individuals who suffer with perceived racism, right, increased risk of blockages in their carotid arteries leading to strokes. Individuals who suffer with perceived racism, we see as well, as we move forward, same thing, coronary artery calcification. In general, we're seeing, once again, this magnitude of disease processes. More diabetes, more blood pressure issues, more issues in terms of heart disease, more issues in terms of cancer as a whole is what we're seeing. Not only that, we're also seeing that our disability, our health span is dropping. Right, we talk about I want to live a long, lengthy period of time, but how well are you living long? There was just someone my wife brought to my attention on social media at the age of 56 who was found dead, passed away in his home. Just the fact that we're living sick or dying sooner, but also that having significant issues that impact your health at a young age, it impacts your ability to gain finances, to mentor your kids, to be a part of the community. These things are extremely important. That we see that in general, it can shorten your epigenes, your longevity. What you pass along, it can transform it when you succumb to the issues of discrimination. There's been a whole lot of bad stuff there, I told you. My wife always says, you know what, you talk about the bad stuff way too much. So why don't you flip the script a little bit? And so I look at things from a standpoint of wonderment. And wonderment is seeing the unfamiliar in the familiar. You all know what I mean. I know this is a little bit, I can't really talk about this, but I'm going to anyway because I loved it as a kid growing up. There was a show once upon a time called The Cosby Show. And it was like my favorite show as a kid growing up in high school. And I used to look at it from the eyes of the kids. As I got older, I started looking at it from the perspective of the parents. I started watching the shows from a different lens, a different perspective. And so when we begin the process of engaging in wonderment, seeing the unfamiliar in the familiar, all of a sudden, we have the ability as healthcare providers to go up the river and figure out why people are falling in as opposed to just doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome. we begin to be impassioned to make changes inside of our community, changes inside of our practice in order to build things. And we begin to look at perspectives from a different angle and realize that maybe it's 4, maybe it's 3. It's how you look at it. Let's change how we look at some of this data. Let's change and see what we're able to do. And as we begin this process, we can begin to focus on resiliency that may be present in many of these communities at risk. That there is a rose that's there in the midst of the storm, that's in the midst of this concrete jungle that many of us live in. And so as we begin to do that, one of the things that we realize, and go back here for just a moment, is that while these inequities have indeed taken and continue to take a devastating toll, there is also a wide heterogeneity in outcomes, suggesting the existence of substantial individual and collective resilience amongst African Americans. I want to end today by focusing on resiliency. That's what we have to build on, the resiliency in the efforts you all are doing. And when we begin to do that, here's an interesting fact. We talked about African Americans are more likely to die and have heart disease. But there's been studies that have been done showing that individuals in the Deep South, in Georgia, and in other areas, Charleston, South Carolina, that they have found that black men experience significantly less coronary disease despite experiencing the racism I spoke about, despite the Southern diet, than others. We see too as well that other studies that we can look at things and say, well, nearly 50% of African Americans have high blood pressure. But what about the 50% who don't? What happens when we start to see what's unique, what's special, what's the secret sauce? What's happening in Wakanda that's keeping them vibrant and alive is what we have to figure out. We want to know the secret that was been housed there. When we look at other studies, in a powerful study from New England Journal of Medicine, it says that though our studies found that African Americans with 2 copies of the high-risk APOL1 variants were at high risk for kidney disease progression, about 40% of the African Americans from the ASK study who also carried the high-risk variants had not progressed to kidney disease. What about the 40%? Let's focus on the 40%. What's special, unique that's going on there? As we begin this, we see this over and over, that when the Dallas Heart Study began to look, they found what? They found that individuals in the African American community, despite obesity, diabetes, and others, had a special genetic variant that led us to develop this really expensive disease that people could probably treat by using nutrition, all right? This PCSK9, and they found they were more common in African Americans, which protected them from disease. What's special? What's happening that's occurring there? Wonderful study happening out of Atlanta by the likes of Herman Taylor, who's leading this study along with Tanae Lewis. And they're looking at what is the impact of resiliency in the community. How can we build community resilience to empower, and what effects does this have on cardiovascular outcomes? And it's so interesting what they're starting to find. They're finding that, guess what? They said, we're going to normalize everything. Let's look at Atlanta. It's pretty disparate. You have a large amount of we're going to break the mold that African Americans, Hispanics, and others are a monolith, that we are different. Some are from Jamaica, from the West Indies. Some are affluent, some are less affluent, some are educated, some are less educated, that you're going to have a wide variety. We're not a monolith. We're a heterogeneous segment of the population. But they said, let's look and let's break and normalize everything down by income, by college graduates, all these things, and we're going to look at outcomes for mortality, ER visits, et cetera. And what's so interesting is they start doing this. They found that individuals who engage with neighbors, as well as the cohesion that they felt, that means that they were comfortable in their own skin, that all of a sudden they seemed to do better, that they had less burden of arterial stiffness, that there was power that was there, that those who had a purpose in life, they too as well seemed to do better, that there's power that's here. They did not cross that line, and so they begin to show this benefit. There's power that's there in terms of it. When we begin to dig closer, we look inside of studies done like the Regard study. And what the Regard study it shows that when you begin to move away from eating some of the Southern-style diet, the sugar-sweetened beverages, the high animal products, that all of a sudden, guess what? Your disease burden dropped, that your survival improved, that your sudden cardiac death rate was low. You had more death inside those who ate the Southern style versus those who ate more of a plant-rich, plant-predominant diet. that we see there. That same thing has been shown in general as it relates to heart failure. We know that the same thing in general has been shown, once again, the risk of sudden death. We see these things play out more and more on a regular basis. We see that the endothelium begins to improve. That when you begin to move patients towards eating a plant-rich diet, this special lining that's damaged by so many factors can improve. There's power in our choice, power in the options, that when we do this, I told you about the AF study, and showing that 40% didn't progress the disease. The regard study also accentuated that. It showed that those who moved away from that Southern style diet, all of a sudden they did better. They lived better, they felt better, had less progression towards kidney failure as well, which is important. We see less burden of stroke. We see less burden too as well as it relates to dementia. We see all these things begin to happen from stroke, dementia. There's such power in our choices. There's power in the foods that we eat. I love this from the Evidence Health 2 study, and you know, we have to resonate and connect with people. And many times people can say, this is an insurmountable odd. I can't wake up at 3 a.m. and work out. I can't eat fruits and vegetables all day and do nothing else. They say, this is just too much for me. But what I like to tell them, and this is the point, small steps lead to big outcomes. That when you begin the process of moving from eating any and everything towards a plant-predominant diet, guess what ends up happening? The weight begins to slowly drop off. That as you begin the process of moving from eating any and everything towards a plant-predominant diet, guess what? The diabetes begins to dissipate. That as you begin the process of moving from eating any and everything towards a plant-predominant diet, very similarly, and you avoid the burden of stress that's perceived from clicking your device here, you'll see blood pressure begin to improve. You'll begin to see all these things happen. There's power. I love this study. Phenomenal study. We all had you heard me give my Wakanda reference earlier. We know about the likes of what transpired with Chadwick Boseman, the early detection for colon cancer, or the death from colon cancer. And so this wonderful study out of Pittsburgh, which showed that swapping the dietary intake from individuals of African descent living in Pittsburgh with those living inside of South Africa, they showed an immediate beginning process of turning on and turning off the precancerous cells. There's power in a short duration of time by the choices that we make and what we expose individuals to. But here's the thing, that in our youth, right, that youth who are the supportive family, you know, like what they showed in this Mecca trial, that all of a sudden that they're exposed, despite their exposure to high levels of racial discrimination, they did not forecast greater epigenetic aging. That when there's support, when there's cohesion, when there's a purpose in life, this resiliency that you all are building here at Downstate, this area that's extending into the community, that it's power for our youth, for the next generation. And that's what I want to leave you with. It's important. The nutrition is key, but everything else that surrounds it is equally as important inside this process. What's so wonderful about the SNAP, and I had to do some reading up on the team here in New York, and I love the work that's being done. It's powerful, powerful to impact our community, the next generation. And so similarly, this study was done a while ago looking at SNAP subsidies. That when you begin to substitute 30% fruit and vegetable subsidy targeted to low-income SNAP basically recipients on a population-wide 10% price reduction in fruits and vegetables, in the remaining population could prevent 230,000 deaths by 2030 and reduce the socioeconomic disparities in cardiovascular disease mortality by 6%. Every little bit helps. Every little effort helps. Your vote helps. The actions help of what transpires there. There's power, and I think it's so similar as we build all this together of the blue zones, the most long-lived individuals across the world. It's about love, not hate. It's about embracing others as much as possible, that when you begin the process of acknowledging the importance of family, and that family could be your community, and having intimate relationships, that when you begin the process of not smoking, including vaping, including some of the other stuff that's plant-based, right? That when you begin to move more than you sit, right? That when you begin to engage socially, when you begin to consume legumes, despite what some cardiothoracic surgeons out there say inside of YouTube and social media, that when you consume beans and legumes, that there's power that's here. When you empower women, when you get out in the sunshine, when you engage in your community gardens, there's power. This is the stuff that longevity is made of. This is the stuff that's powerful, that is life-changing. That's what we're starting to see take hold and manifest. That's there. I want to propose to you that we can also create black and urban blue zones. I want to tell you that we can create it. We can. The power is with us to do so, each and every one of us. And as we do it, it's important. I'll tell you, I didn't come up with this alone. I'm going to tell you this right now. So when we see this, we know that once you get African Americans to reach an age close to 80, that they live as long as everyone else. There is no disparities. You imagine the power that it takes in order for someone to get to that age. My mom is, I can't say what my mom's age is. She'll get mad at me, all right? My mom looks about 70. She's about 16, 17 years older than that, though, all right? I'll just play it that way. You can do the math. I'm going to have you all play this in just a moment, okay? Because you can click it and play it. I don't want to mess this up. But this is powerful. I believe there are black blue zones hidden, like little areas of Wakanda, around the United States. I'm just looking to find it. I think we have to go and tap into it. We have to take a standpoint of wonderment and begin to look and explore with a different lens and perspective on how we can transform life, transform health inside these communities, and we will find individuals just like this individual, Dr. Ernest Rogers, 93, who decided to marry, not get his vows renewed, but to marry a nail right at age 91. I'll tell you that he went on to live about another additional 10 years from this. Go ahead and click this for me if you don't mind.
First take to the nail, take you and to be my wedded wife, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold, to love and to hold. You may embrace your bride.
I'm telling you, okay, when I'm 93, I want to be able to embrace my wife. I want to be able to renew my vows. I want to be able to live inside of a black blue zone. I want to see a world that's different than what we're experiencing right now and have loved ones around us. And this is the power that you have in it. Food is powerful. Food is a right. We have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of health. It's powerful that's there. So I want you all to remember that, continue to fight the good fight, and thank you for spending time with me today.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Batiste. We do have a little bit of time to take some questions. So if there are questions from the audience, you can go to the back of the auditorium. We have the microphone is up here now. You can come down here and ask any questions that you might have. And if you have questions in our remote audience, go ahead and type them into the chat, and our Zoom moderators will ask the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for an inspiring talk, which is very apropos of our community in central Brooklyn, which is littered with food apartheid, food deserts, disparities, and the like. And you also gave a message of empowerment and hope. So my question to you is, given the disparities that exist, if we can have minority communities, Black, brown, Hispanic, and others, embrace the proper lifestyle and diet, can we, number one, get a disproportionate benefit as opposed to other individuals? And number two, can we actually ultimately level the playing field so there are no longer any disparities among the outcomes?
Yeah, no, great question, and I absolutely agree. I think that, one, I'll say yes. I think we have to meet people where they're at. I think as we all understand, it's about respect. Respect of culture, respect of that there's power. So I'll never forget when I was inside New Orleans. My folks are from New Orleans. And they actually asked me to talk about health in New Orleans, right? And so as we're there, what I chose to do was to focus on the power. And so I began to describe to them red beans and rice, the power of the legumes that's there. I began to describe to them the collard greens that are there. I began to go through the issues of the components, the spices. I began to reflect back on the historical aspect of how there was such resiliency inside of those who were enslaved to garden. They had their own quote-unquote urban gardens, community gardens, to pick and supplement their dietary intake. And so I think the first thing is recognizing whether or not it's whatever the culture. I was chatting with someone last night, and I think I brought up the fact that when I'm speaking with individuals, it doesn't matter if you're from a Latin background, if you're from a South Asian background, I try to connect at a level that honors you. I try and bring out areas within your culture that accentuate the power of food and nutrition. But you're absolutely right. I think the other aspect to your question that came to my mind and resonated is that what do we compare in every single trial of pharmaceutical therapy to? We compare it to what? A placebo. A placebo is an inert compound. Has no biological effects. Typically, it's sugar substance that's there. We're looking essentially, we're comparing a pharmaceutical agent to the power of the mind, a belief that there is strength that's there. I think the one thing that we, as Western medicine, we don't recognize a lot of times, all of us, myself included, is the power of the mind, and that there's huge. And I think that's where aspects of that are beginning to show of stress. But we're also seeing that when a person has belief, there's power that's there. And there are studies that have demonstrated this, that belief in the medication is more likely to work if the physician empowers them for belief, as opposed to the other way. So thank you for that question.
Hi, I'm Dr. Viswanathan from SUNY Downstate. It's really indeed a pleasure, it's a really impactful talk. And I think one of the things which we need also is role models, and especially in the African American communities, people like you, who have really achieved a lot. When the kids see that and they realize the importance of the changes you have made, that's important. A case in point is I have read Mayor Eric Adams' book, and I'm surprised many people don't even know that he has written a book, about the first part of the book is the most impactful. It shows how he transformed himself and how he also managed to convince people, his partner and his police officer friends, and also even his mother, to change their entire, diet, which is based on years. And one important point he makes is the point you also made. The African American food here is not the African food in the African countries, which are largely plant-based. And I think if that message also gets to the communities, they also, people always worry about the culture and profound transformation. Yes. This is in sync, with some thousands of years old of culture. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I just want to add to that just momentarily. I think that, there's an adage that says, the greatest sermon is the one that's lived, right? And so I would think that we have to be a living example of what we're trying to convey. And I think the work by my dear colleague, the interventional radiologist there, who's working with the hip-hop community to really demonstrate the power of example in the community so people can see it, living and breathing, because you can't aspire to something if you don't know it exists. That's why it's so powerful. I showed the slide about the connectivity between seeing despair happen. In other words, if you see someone that looks like you who is beaten or has an issue happen, it triggers stress. But on the converse side, remember, we're going to look through the lens of wonderment. If I begin to see people who have achieved a level, i.e. Mayor Adams, I all of a sudden think I can aspire. If I see an Obama, I think I can aspire that maybe I too can do it. That when I see these, and so it's important for there to be living examples, I think, throughout community, and I think that's a burden. So against Charles Barkley, I love him on TNT, I love basketball, we all are role models. Every single one of us are.
Thank you for your marvelous talk. I wanted to recommend the film that's coming out soon called They're Trying to Kill Us, and I don't know if you've seen it, but it really elucidates that Food injustice and food apartheid is by design, and it includes Mayor Adams having the last word in the film. I just wanted your comment on the fact that the general population in the United States identifies as vegan. 3% of the general population identifies as vegan, whereas in the African American community, 8% identify as vegan. And just how we can build upon this and really what is our call to action today. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And that is a wonderful film that's done by John Lewis. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, follow him on social media. I won't call out his social media name. We can get that to you afterwards, or other things. But his site there, Trying to Kill Us, is a wonderful film. There's other documentaries as well out there, Invisible Vegan, as well as all the other traditional ones of Forks Over Knives and so forth. But sometimes that resonation with people on a cultural level can be powerful. In terms of the call to action, in terms of what we can do, in terms of moving things the dial forward, I think that we have to persist. I think that we have to be very intentional to the large-scale population. I think our job is to deliver the information that can allow our community to understand just what is out there, right? And so when we look at the fact that African Americans are now 8%, I think it's a vestige of the fact of trying to figure out how I can be healthy on my own. They care about their health. When we look at the issues and the impact of COVID, one of the things that came out is that there's an issue of, they call these essential workers, a new label for it. Well, think about when doctor's offices visits are. 8:30 to 5, 9 to 5, when people have to work. What do we write inside of our charts? Non-compliant. Doesn't show up, missed their appointment. What do we say when someone can't afford the medications as we're pressed for time and we're on our computer and we hand a prescription over and they don't get it filled because they can't afford this particular medication? You haven't forced a relationship. We say they're non-compliant. And so I think that what ends up happening is that people begin the process of trying to seek and see what else can they do. And that's why it's important, a gentleman who brought up in terms of example, and Dr. Roosevelt, about being models in the community and having an understanding that there are resources that we can go to, and we have to have a shift inside of our medical system. You all are doing it, the likes and the things that are happening, but there has to be a shift that when we're pressed to see patients in 10 minutes, how can we expect to forge a relationship? And so it becomes important. That's why where this becomes important. That's where nonprofits become important. That's where churches become important, to really empower and enable people working with their providers by still doing what they can do on their own.
I wanted to say first, I was really inspired to be introduced to you through your February moderation series on Chef AJ channel, and every conversation you had was so powerful and impactful, and thank you for today as well. I'm curious on a personal level, what initiatives either you're involved in or you're aware of have you most energized now to tackle some of these issues you've discussed today?
Oh, thank you for asking that. I told you I'm horrible at social media or self-promotion kind of thing. One of the things that I'm very excited to be a part of is a nonprofit that I help at least launch. My wife runs it with a team that I'm not on the board, and it is called Healthy Heart Nation. And so it is tackling things from the standpoint of providing educational scholarships for individuals to go for higher level of education. They help fund one of the series I do on YouTube in terms of conversations about health disparities and about health and wellness in general, called Slave Food Conversations. We also are looking in terms of justice and trying to see how we can be impactful in the community. And then from a business standpoint. So that's very powerful. That is my passion project right now, is working with it. And I'll tell you the biggest one, I'm gonna let something out the hat, is that I'm working on a conference as well. We're working on a conference that we're looking to really tackle those areas on the site campus of a historically black college and university. And so that way we can have a model, and we have a representation in terms of the power of lifestyle, the power of the interrelationship between the community in there. So that's something right now that really has me going. And then lastly, I'll say is I'm finally stepping foot in the realm of trying to write a book. I'm not trying, I'm writing a book. I'm in the process of writing a book. Really, it's about the solution. So it's a little bit different. I'm not really talking about the bad stuff. I'm only talking about the good stuff, all right? And I'll leave you with a teaser. It's called Selfish. Those of you who haven't heard me talk about selfish. So it's about you getting selfish in order to kind of get to live a life of purpose. It's really what the goal is.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gail Stanback, and I'm into public health. And I'm interested in how do you think that agriculture for our children is important and what can contribute to this cause for plant-based?
Oh, thank you. That's a wonderful question. You know, I don't even want, I think it was Ron Finley who said it's just such a wonderful, it summarizes everything real well. They called him, I think, the gangster gardener, or whatever it was. And so he said, you know, if our kids grow it, our kids will eat it. And I think our kids have to really see the power of food, that really where food comes from. They're so used to like strawberry flavored this. But to see, once again, I don't just say this just to say it, but the beauty of those water pitchers there with all the fruits inside of it and everything like that, and for kids to really understand this actually comes from the ground, that you actually can pick it, you can grow it, you can taste it. All of a sudden now they begin the process of making things and doing trials. I think it's so powerful at a base foundational level for kids to understand food and the sourcing of food that's there. So I think it can make huge impacts, and I think it's something that will have a domino effect in their future. Thank you for asking that.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Dr. Batiste. My question is, how do we bridge that gap between the faith-based ministries and adopting this plant-based nutritional attitude? Because all around us is all this food that we really should be shifting. In the church, we shout, honestly, but we carry the most diseases, physically, mentally, and emotionally. How do we motivate them to get more inspired about their health condition? Yes, faith is faith, but health is health.
Wonderful question. I'm gonna tell you, I think that connectivity, it's extremely important in that relationship, and that's something that I seek to try and bridge that gap on a regular basis, because for years, the church was a central part of the African American community and many communities that are there, and a source in terms of saying, you know what, we need to rally against this injustice. We have to look at the injustice of food and the domino effect that it has, and so starting with the leaders in the church, leadership in the church, really I think is a targeted approach to get buy-in. That's the first and foremost. And then beginning not to take away from what individuals feel is their culture, but begin to add to it. Begin to provide them sight, taste, and sound, right? You can't just, it's not good enough for me to say, eat better. I gotta show you what that tastes like. It's about flavor, right? When person thinks of like plant-based, they think, oh, I'm just having some green leafy vegetables. I don't want that. I'm not gonna eat that. Or, oh, what's gonna happen to me? I'm gonna shrivel away. It's like, no, you're not going to shrivel up. You can actually have really good food, all very similar in fashion. And so I'm a big believer in this is the one time you'll hear me say, right, is about that transition is extremely important. And so sometimes having some of the alternative foods, it's helpful to make people open the door towards healthier eating, right? And I've come full circle. I was a staunch anti-anything processed, and I realized that there is a role for it there. But thank you for that. I think that community gardens, I think being intentional, I think we should transform church parking lots, at least in California. There's limited parking here in New York, but into community gardens and be a source for the community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Doc. Thank you so much for your awesome presentation today. I'm Dr. Linda Almighty. We know that gut health is a very, very, very serious thing, and it's involved in every aspect of our health. My question to you is nightshade foods. What is your take on that as it relates not just to heart health, but overall health?
Yeah. You know, I think so the question was really as it pertains to nightshade foods, nightshade vegetables, and so forth. That's kind of come up to light. There is a paucity of data that I found, you know, and perhaps anyone can share with me that I've seen that to show the extreme detriment of tomatoes and some of the other aspects there. There's some of the peppers. We know some of the power that's there, so I haven't seen it. I do think that we're not, once again, a monolith of individuals. I think that people will respond and react differently, but thus far, when I've looked at large scale, I have not seen anything that has detracted my ability to recommend still the power that's found in many of those foods. So I do recommend that. I think gut health is extremely important. I think that we're learning more about the interrelationship between our gut microbiome and between our health outcomes, and every aspect influences it. And so there's much more to come, but for right now, I recommend eating. Now, I'll have individuals who say, Doc, I just don't, it doesn't react well with me. I'm like, okay, well, let's eat this instead, right? I don't have studies to support that, but let's eat this instead. And I think that's the role we have to take.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Batiste, for that wonderful presentation. I'm Danielle Medina, and I am a Food for Life instructor with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And we launched a pilot that was specifically for African Americans. And I was teaching the pilot, and it was talking about foods that are related to soul foods and the difference of, more being plant-based. And I wanted to see what your take on the connection of soul foods really being slave foods and the emotional attachment to these foods. When I'm speaking to my participants, how do you approach that in the emotional need of like remembering these foods in their diets and trying to change more to a plant-based diet?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for your work that you're doing in terms of spreading information and being targeted. I think it can be a challenge, and I've kind of touched on components of that already. I think that one of the main aspects is, number one, acknowledging the culture. So I tend to speak from a standpoint of, okay, what's good? Love the greens. Can we get, let's get the ham hock out of it. All right, let's get the neck bone out of it. Let's get certain components out. Love the red beans. You don't have to actually add meat to it. I never forget one time when I was dating my wife, I made a pot of beans for her. And a whole entire spread. Yes, I can cook, okay? No culinary training, it was by de facto. I come from a long family of cookers and so forth. And so I threw down on these beans, and this one guy from the South, he was like, come on, Doc, you can't tell me there's no ham in these beans. I'm like, no, you don't have to have ham in the beans, right? And he swore up and down these beans are incredible. And so it begins this process of acknowledging, number one, the culture of what they're used to, because that bond is important. When I remember of my dad, passed on August 12, 2010, I remember and reflect on going to an ice cream shop. I remember going to an ice cream shop, it had a little mold inside the glass. I remember the smell of it. He loved pineapple on that soft serve. It triggers memories every time I bring up this story and talk about it. It triggers memories of it. That's an emotion. Now, I can choose to go and have the same thing to highlight those memories, or I can choose to acknowledge his memory for the kids and for the future and say, you know what, we're going to create new memories. That's a little bit healthier, a little bit different, ways in which we can accentuate. And so that's what my approach is. I try to, one, acknowledge, and then give them a chance to transform and begin that process. Thank you.
Can I also add that Mayor Adams' book very well addresses this point. This is an important issue.
Yes.
Thank you to Dr. Batiste. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear just a short video presentation from a recent graduate of Plant-Powered Metro New York's 21-day Jumpstart program. This is an organization here in New York City that we've been working with for the past few years. They are just fantastic at getting more access to plant-based foods out to people, education, and their Jumpstart program is great. So let's watch this quick video, and then we'll move on to our next speaker.